Well, good evening, everyone. What a great turnout. A lot of Shakespeare fans, or Paul Budra fans, or SFU fans in the audience. All three. Thank you so much for being here. My name's Andrew Petter. I'm the president of Simon Fraser University, and let me start by acknowledging that we are indeed privileged to be gathered on the unceded ancestral lands of the Tsleil-Waututh, Squamish, Coquitlam, and Musqueam nations. And it's just wonderful to be here this evening for the final lecture in this academic year's President's Faculty Lecture Series. And great to be in this beautiful venue, not too far from Burnaby Mountain in our campus, but right in the community at the Shadbolt Center for the Arts. This lecture series is part of a larger program that SFU created to really represent our vision to be Canada's most community-engaged research university. It's a program called SFU Public Square. It's a signature initiative of our commitment to be there for the community, along with other initiatives like the Burnaby Festival of Learning, which I hope you all show up for as well, which is a partnership between us and the city of Burnaby, very much for the community. But if you check out the SFU Public Square website, you'll see there's many things going on, lots of opportunities for you to engage in Burnaby, on our Burnaby campus, but also downtown Vancouver. Really exciting lectures and dialogues and opportunities for the public to not only become engaged, but to participate and contribute to important discussions. Now, tonight we're going to hear a great lecture, I know, and there'll be a chance then for some questions and comments. And after that, there'll be a very modest reception, because these are tough economic times for universities. But modest in food, not modest in conversation, I'm sure. And Paul's kindly agreed to hold back a bit and carry on some conversation after the question and answer period as part of the reception. And that brings me to the reason you're here this evening, and that is to introduce our speaker for the evening, Dr. Paul Budra, who is from SFU's Department of English, who teaches Shakespeare, a good thing in light of tonight's topic. Also teaches early modern literature. Paul's published 6 books and numerous articles on Renaissance literature and contemporary popular culture. But some of you might know him better from the crowds he draws every summer for public lectures that he gives in association with Vancouver's Bard and the Beach Shakespeare Festival. He's also the past chair of the English department, a former associate dean of SFU's Faculty of Arts and Social Science, and has served as the president of the Pacific Northwest Renaissance Society. I know he also plays a little rock and roll on the side, but I'm not sure. That wasn't in my notes. I just happened to know that. He's been a recipient of SFU's Excellence in Teaching Award, and he's currently the director of SFU Publications. Now, the subject of tonight's lecture is intriguing, maybe the reason you're here, the Shakespeare Conspiracy. Since times immemorial, human beings have been fascinated with conspiracy theories, and I must say, no less today than in Shakespeare's time. But like you, I'm really looking forward to learning more about this from Paul, and considering how Shakespeare's plays inform maybe our modern notions of conspiracies. And without further ado, I'll ask you to join me in providing a very warm Burnaby welcome to Dr. Paul Budra.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Andrew, President Petter. And I also want to thank Andrew because his office has, for many years now, helped sponsor the Bard Explored lecture series that I give every summer at Bard on the Beach. And I noticed a number of familiar hoodlum faces from those lectures. I also want to thank Mary Hartman from Bard on the Beach, who is here. She's the educational coordinator at Bard on the Beach. It was her idea to have those lecture series, and she's with us tonight. And at the end of my talk, if you have any questions about Shakespeare, please address them to Mary. And also, I just want to thank you all for coming out on a cold Tuesday night. It's very Shakespearean of you to be here during a plague year. So they told me to talk for almost an hour. I'm not going to go quite that long. 45 minutes, 50 minutes, something like that. And I'd like to start by telling you about 2 emails that I received this past year. The first, which arrived about 8 months ago, was from a man called Alan Turicka. It was very short, but what it lacked in substance, it more than made up with in vitriol and obscenity. Mr. Tarica informed me that I was, and I'll here substitute some words, a blinking idiot who did not deserve to be a blinking professor at any blinking university. As I recall, he concluded by suggesting that I do something with my own body, which I believe to be anatomically impossible. Now, apparently, he was angry at me for having failed to respond to an earlier email he had sent me, and I had no memory of this. So I go through my email record and I find it. Some 6 months previous, he had sent me an email which contained no writing, just a link to a website. And on this website, there was an article written by him scientifically proving, in his words, that William Shakespeare did not write the plays and poems of William Shakespeare. They were, according to Mr. Tarsia, written by the 17th Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere. The scientific method he employed to reach this conclusion was to read Shakespeare's sonnet sequence backwards. As he explains in his Twitter feed from 2015, I have given Shakespeare's sonnets clear and unambiguous authorial attention. There is only one way to read them, and other ways are clearly wrong. The second email was more friendly, but slightly unnerving. You see, when I was asked to give a talk inspired by Mr. Tarica, I came up with the title, The Shakespeare Conspiracy. I thought it sounded cool. 2 weeks after I submitted the title, I received an email from a man named Ted Bacino. He wanted to know if I would like a complimentary copy of his novel, which I'd never heard of, called The Shakespeare Conspiracy. Now, someone more paranoid than I would at this point begin wearing an aluminum foil hat in their office so people couldn't steal their ideas. He sent me the novel, which is self-published, and the storyline is about Christopher Marlowe, the real poet and playwright who was murdered in 1593. In Mr. Bacino's novel, he doesn't die. He fakes his own death and continues to write plays using the alias William Shakespeare. And although this is a novel, and therefore supposed to be a work of fiction, it contains a 50-page index full of facts that support the fictional narrative. And it says on the cover, the story of the greatest literary deception of all time, based entirely on historical facts. So the fiction of the novel, then, is a distraction. Mr. Bacino, like Mr. Tarica, is selling a conspiracy theory about the authorship of Shakespeare's plays. He's just doing it under the pretense of fiction. Now, we live in an age of conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories have come to dominate the news. It's hard to keep track. There are conspiracy theories about the coronavirus, vaccinations, 9/11, school shootings, airplane vapor trails. A man named Mike Hughes recently died while trying to prove that the Earth was flat by flying to the edge of space in a homemade rocket on the assumption that scientists, geographers, map makers, pilots, and astronauts have, for centuries, conspired to lie about the shape of our planet. The politics of our neighbors to the south have been corrupted by the influence of conspiracy theories, often approved at the highest level. In February, President Donald Trump awarded the Medal of Freedom to the radio host and conspiracy theorist Rush Limbaugh, a man who recently argued that the coronavirus was weaponized by the Chinese to attack Trump. Now, conspiracy theories are not new. Historians have traced them in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, and more recently, we children of the 20th century, some of us, will remember the conspiracy theories around the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, the moon landing, Roswell, and others. But they seem to have accelerated and spread thanks almost entirely to the internet. Try this little experiment when you get home. Open Google. Type in any random noun followed by the word conspiracy, and something will show up. I tried it. The word I used was dog. Dog conspiracy, and I found several conspiracies about Barack Obama's dog. Now, this is not to say that there are not real conspiracies. Powerful people have tried to affect history through clandestine back channels, sometimes with success. Think about Watergate and the Iran-Contra affair. What I'm interested in is what philosopher Brian Keeley calls unwarranted conspiracy theories, such as the bizarre and toxic QAnon theories that have convinced some people that there is, to quote the journalist Matthew Raza, a worldwide cabal of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who rule the world, and they control everything. They control politicians, they control the media, they control Hollywood, and they cover up their existence, and they would have continued ruling the world were it not for the election of President Donald Trump. Now, historians, sociologists, psychologists, political scientists, and even philosophers have all studied conspiracy theory through different conceptual lenses. I'm a literary critic, so what I would like to do is look at conspiracy theories through that lens, to critique them as a literary genre, to see if we can make any generalizations about them as a narrative form, which is a bit tricky, as many of these conspiracy theories are never written out in a single coherent document. It's also tricky because it's potentially a huge topic. So I'm going to focus on three things. One is the drivers of conspiracy theories. I'm going to focus on one driver, their primary literary device, and their narrative form. And I'm going to use Shakespeare for a couple of reasons. First, I study Shakespeare. I know a little bit about the plays and the historical era. Also, Shakespeare lived in an era of real conspiracy. There were three major plots to assassinate Queen Elizabeth, the last of which, the Babington plot, had the support of Mary, Queen of Scots, and ended up costing her her head. There were a number of plots to assassinate Elizabeth's successor, King James I, the most famous of which was the Gunpowder Plot of 1605, in which dissident Catholics came very close to blowing up the Parliament buildings and killing the royal family. That miraculous rescue is, of course, still celebrated in England on November 5th, Guy Fawkes Day. And Shakespeare represents conspiracies in his plays. Some are based on actual historical events. The short-lived plot against Henry V in his play by that title. And of course, one of the most famous and successful conspiracies in Western history, the plot to assassinate Julius Caesar. Shakespeare also invented conspiracies, many of them funny. The plot against Falstaff in Henry IV, Part 1. The plot against Malvolio in Twelfth Night. But most important, of course, is the fact that Shakespeare is one of the few world authors, maybe the only world author, about whom conspiracy theories have circulated. Finally, the reason I'm using this Shakespeare theory from amongst hundreds of other conspiracy theories I could choose is that it's low stakes. It will not impact public health policy or any coming election. So I hope it can be discussed without inspiring the passions that some other conspiracy theories do. So before we get going any further, though, let me say that I'm not going to spend a lot of time tonight trying to debunk the conspiracy theories about Shakespeare. I'm going to mention a bunch of things, but I hope they illustrate my points. I'm going to extrapolate out from them. And the reason I'm not just taking on the conspiracy theories tonight, well, there's two reasons. First of all, it's been done. Scholars like James Shapiro and Irvin Lee Mattis and Paul Edmondson have exhaustively dealt with these conspiracies. Shapiro details the history of the Shakespeare conspiracy theories. Mattis and Edmondson do excellent jobs of showing how the conspiracy theorists have both distorted and edited the historical record in support of their theories. And I'd be happy to point you towards their books. And second, and this brings me to the first defining feature of conspiracy theories in general, anything I would say would not matter, because conspiracy theories are tautological. They are circular. For the conspiracy theorist, the lack of any evidence to support his theory is itself proof of the theory. It means the true facts, the real story, have been covered up, hidden, the evidence suppressed or destroyed. Second, any historical documents or facts that may contradict the proposed conspiracy are, of course, themselves part of the conspiracy. They have been planted. They are part of a clever smokescreen to hide the truth. So a little thought experiment here using Shakespeare. Let us imagine that tomorrow some archivist in the British archives comes across a 16th century document, and it says, hey, Everyone knows that Shakespeare was a front for the Earl of Oxford, and a whole bunch of us, theater companies and theater owners and fellow playwrights and printers and rivals and friends and fans, we all colluded to hide the fact. If that document was found, I would be flabbergasted. I would start drinking. But I would also, once I sobered up, immediately have to reassess everything that I think I know about the theatrical practice and authorship of Elizabethan England. I would have to do that as a scholar. But let's imagine, on the other hand, that a 16th century document shows up that lists Shakespeare as one of the living successful dramatists of the Elizabethan stage, and lists, say, the Earl of Oxford as another dramatist in the pantheon of writers in this period, a distinct and separate author. Or let's imagine a 17th century document shows up that talks about the living author, the poet, Shakespeare, and this years after the death of the Earl of Oxford and Christopher Marlowe. Or imagine we have private notes and book marginalia that mention Shakespeare as a writer, or reminiscences about him from his friends. In all those cases, the conspiracy theorists will explain the documents away as part of the cover-up. I know that to be true because all those documents and many more exist, and the conspiracy theorists have rationalized them away. So, let us begin by briefly looking at the conspiracy theories about Shakespeare's authorship for context. My email friends, Mr. Pacino and Mr. Tarica, have helped me introduce two conspiracy theories about Shakespeare. That he was really Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, or he was the poet and playwright Christopher Marlowe. Other candidates for the real Shakespeare have included a cabal of politicians: Sir Walter Raleigh, Edmund Spencer, Sir Francis Bacon, William Stanley, 6th Earl of Derby, Roger Manners, 5th Earl of Rutland, Mary Sidney, Edward Dwyer, William Nugent, Henry Neville, the Irishman Patrick O'Toole of Ennis, the Italian Michelangelo Florio, or his son, Amelia Lanier, and Queen Elizabeth I herself. The late Muammar Gaddafi argued that Shakespeare was actually an Arab named Sheikh Zabar. And I didn't have time to put it in this because just yesterday I found another one. There is a group in Catalonia, northern Spain, who are trying to prove that Shakespeare was a Catalan. Now, Svetlana Boyum has argued that conspiracy theories flourish at a time of crisis, of political change and social change, but I'm not sure I agree. The conspiracy theories about Shakespeare and many of the conspiracy theories we see today seem not so much the product of some immediate crisis, but a failure of imagination. Now, that might sound counterintuitive because so many conspiracy theories are wildly fanciful and imaginative. Since 1999, one David Icke has been arguing that the world is essentially run by shape-shifting alien reptiles. The failure I'm talking about is an inability or willful disinclination to think beyond one's own preconceptions, experience, or culture, responding instead to the exceptional, the foreign, and the inexplicable with disbelief. A disbelief that can morph into a paranoia that imposes patterns on reality, patterns that are sometimes presumed to be the product of some controlling agent. So let's look at the conspiracy theories around Shakespeare in this light. The first full articulation of these theories came in the 19th century. To understand their genesis, and to understand the genesis of any conspiracy theories, I think, we have to understand the culture and the specific failures of imagination that generated them. There were three main cultural drivers of this conspiracy theory: Romanticism, bardolatry, and autobiography. Romanticism was an artistic and intellectual movement that caught on at the end of the 18th century. It was a reaction against the rationality of the Enlightenment, and it emphasized the emotional, the natural, and artistic genius. And the latter is important. The emphasis on the artist as a creative genius, unshackled by traditions and conventions, born, not trained. William Wordsworth, the great Romantic poet, said this: "What is a poet? He is a man speaking to men, A man, it is true, endued with more lively sensibility, more enthusiasm and tenderness, who has a greater knowledge of human nature and a more comprehensive soul than are supposed to be common among mankind. I hate the Romantics. So, the artist is an exceptional individual rather than, say, a skilled craftsman. And the idea is very much still with us. The Romantics saw in Shakespeare a prototype of themselves, the natural genius, unfettered by stultifying education and training. And by the way, just a little side note, the idea that Shakespeare was incredibly learned is a relatively new one. Shakespeare in his time and in the centuries immediately after was celebrated as a poet of nature and love, not learning. Shakespeare's contemporary, Ben Jonson, made fun of Shakespeare's lack of learning, his small Latin and less Greek. John Milton called Shakespeare fancy's child, that is, the poet of imagination rather than learning, who warbled his wood notes wild. So an untutored genius, a natural-born genius like the Romantics themselves. The rise of Romanticism occurred around the same time and is intertwined with the rise of bardolatry, the worship of Shakespeare, which reached a peak in the mid to late 19th century, the Victorian period. There's a number of things that contributed to this and fueled it. The actor and theatrical impresario David Garrick promoted the genius of Shakespeare for financial reasons and held a Shakespeare Jubilee in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1769. Shakespeare was useful because he had written so much. He was a source of quotable wisdom, and this made him into sort of a secular moral authority, and there were all sorts of collections of his sayings. He had royalist tendencies, which in the age of revolution, the 19th century, the British celebrated and exported across their empire. And he was long dead, so he could stage his plays for free. By 1840, Thomas Carlyle, could write an essay called The King Shakespeare. And this is what he says. Shakespeare is the chief of all poets hitherto, the greatest intellect who in our recorded world has left record of himself in the way of literature. Wow. So you have this romantic concept of the artist as a great man, a special breed, combined with the assumption that Shakespeare was the greatest artist of all time. That meant Shakespeare was the greatest man, someone who should have left a trail of glory through history. But that's not what the historical record shows. It shows a middle-class country boy who worked very, very hard, immersed himself in the world of theater, stuck with the same theatrical company for years, was careful with money, and retired rich. It's not very romantic. Especially the idea of writing for money, which many found irreconcilable with their image of King Shakespeare, the dispenser of universal truths. The third factor was the rise of autobiography in the 19th century. There's no real autobiographical literature in Shakespeare's time. All you will find in terms of autobiography are a handful of spiritual diaries. One of my colleagues, now retired, Paul Delaney, wrote the first big book on the history of autobiographies in English literature, and he comes to the same conclusion. In the age of Shakespeare, there's nothing. The word autobiography wasn't invented until 1797. But by the end of the 19th century, Oscar Wilde could say, "We live in an age when men treat art as if it were meant to be a form of autobiography." People, especially critics, came to assume that literature was necessarily autobiographical, and many writers were happy to plumb their own lives for source material. And just think about this for a minute. This would mean that Mario Puzo was a member of the mafia, and that Isaac Asimov had pet robots, and it's ludicrous. But anyway, the idea would have been crazy in Shakespeare's time. The plays of the Elizabethan theater, the plays of Shakespeare, were based almost entirely on existing stories, not the playwrights' lives. So you get these three movements combined to create a set of preconceptions that the Victorians assumed were universal truths about art and artists. And some could simply not imagine a different model. Those people could not imagine Shakespeare as a diligent middle-class craftsman. They could not imagine him as an uninteresting person. They couldn't imagine him not writing about himself. Their imagination failed to accommodate another model of artistic creation. So an alternate narrative, one that fit their preconceptions, was needed. Shakespeare must have been a great man, obviously, who for some reason disguised his identity under the pseudonym Shakespeare, or used the real Shakespeare as a patsy. We just have to read his plays and poems to figure out who he is, because all literature is autobiographical, right? Everyone knows that. The first person to make a prolonged case for this idea was one Delia Bacon, who argued that Shakespeare's works were in fact written by Sir Francis Bacon, no relation, the English philosopher and statesman. And this theory was popular for some decades and was propped up by elaborate readings of secret codes and anagrams in Shakespeare's works. The next and most enduring theory was proposed by one Thomas Looney. We will pause over his surname. He did not find any recorded facts or historical documents that suggested that anyone but William Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon had written the plays and poems, because there aren't any. Rather, he took it as an article of faith that Shakespeare would have had to have been a greater, more exciting man. And he sat down and he wrote up a list of the attributes he believed Shakespeare must have had. You see what he's doing? In other words, he's reversing Genesis. He created a god in his own image. He then looked into Elizabethan history to find someone who he thought fit the image he had created. And he stumbled upon Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, and said, "That's my man." The vast number of impossibilities for this attribution, not the least of which was the death of de Vere's in 1604, Shakespeare is still turning out plays in 1612, 1613, were dismissed. What was important was Looney thought he could trace in Shakespeare's plays references to the events and circumstances of de Vere's own life. His argument, and the argument of his followers to this day, not the least of which is Alan Turyk, is that the plays and the poems are disguised autobiography. Which brings me back to conspiracy theories as literature. The dominant literary device that conspiracy theorists employ is allegory. Now, a quick reminder for those of you who have forgotten high school English. An allegory is a narrative in which characters and events consistently refer to another set of characters and events or ideas. The most famous example in 20th century literature would be George Orwell's Animal Farm, which tells the story of a group of farm animals taking control of the farm on which they live. But the various animal characters and events refer to characters and events in the Russian Revolution. The longest allegorical poem in the English language was Edmund Spenser's The Faerie Queen, which was published in Shakespeare's lifetime. In this epic poem, knights representing different virtues go on a series of adventures that test them. So, for example, Red Cross Knight, who represents holiness, must battle error and pride and other forms of falsehood. Now, people who write allegories, they want their readers to get it. That's the whole point, to teach and delight. But allegories don't just teach and delight. There's a long tradition of using allegorical reading to understand the world. You find that tradition in religion. Many religions read both their holy texts and human history itself as an allegory. Certain parts of the Bible, especially the more confusing ones, such as the book of Revelations, have been interpreted as allegories for centuries, often with the aim of predicting an impending apocalypse. And indeed, the Bible is full of allegories. Christ's parables are small allegories. This resorting to allegorical reading is necessary because most religions hold their sacred texts to be inviolable and perfect, the word of God or one of his prophets. If there are things that are not clear, they must be symbolic or allegorical. Further, many believers read history allegorically, believing that if we but read human events correctly, we will see revealed the plan of God. History is a sort of benign conspiracy, an unfolding revelation of God's purpose, his plan, his preordained narrative. So, history is a type of allegory. The religious texts may be read allegorically, and they can support each other. Now, what conspiracy theorists in general argue is that the received narrative of any event, be it 9/11 or the moon landing, the official story is not the real story. The received narrative points to the real underlying narrative that they, as expert critics, see. So they're reading those events allegorically. The Shakespeare conspiracy theorists come close to religion's use of allegory in that they read two types of allegory. First, they read conventional history, the accounts of Elizabethan theater and court, as a sort of cover-up. And second, they read Shakespeare's works allegorically as a form of disguised autobiography, as I mentioned. Let me give you just one really, really quick example. In Shakespeare's play, King Lear has 3 daughters. The Earl of Oxford had 3 daughters. Again, this does ignore the fact that almost all of Shakespeare's plays are based on existing stories. And there were stories and plays about King Lear and his 3 daughters well before Shakespeare's play of that name. And please note, there were allegorical plays in Shakespeare's period, but they were clearly allegorical. Morality plays like Everyman, which has a character named Everyman, who meets a character named Death, who asks him to go on a journey. Okay? The biggest theatrical blockbuster of the English Renaissance was a play called A Game at Chess by Thomas Middleton. It was an allegorical and satirical treatment of England's failed policies against Spain during the reign of James I. It is not subtle. The authorities got the allegory and they shut the play down. But there are no allegorical plays about authors' lives in this period. Bardolatry made Shakespeare's writings particularly susceptible to this sort of biblical interpretation. As mentioned, King Shakespeare was held up as a moral authority, but not just a moral authority. The word most often used to describe Shakespeare in the late 19th century was, as James Shapiro has noted, divine. In the 19th century and beyond, Shakespeare's plays were treated the way religions treat their sacred texts, as inviolable and perfect. Any errors or inconsistencies in the text were dismissed as mistakes by the printers. Some critics argued that parts of the plays that didn't seem right weren't really good, must have been inserted by someone else. Some critics even dismissed entire plays, like Titus Andronicus, as the work of someone other than Shakespeare. The divine Shakespeare could not have written this bloody mess of a play. And if you don't know this play, tonight go and rent Titus, the movie version with Anthony Hopkins. Different side of Shakespeare. So Shakespeare's texts were a sort of secular scripture, their perfection a matter of faith. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the first 2 Shakespeare conspiracy theorists were religious people. Delia Bacon was a Puritan, and Mr. Looney belonged to a cult called the Religion of Humanity, a branch of a positivist movement begun by the French philosopher Auguste Comte. And this movement exalted Shakespeare and a number of other people like St. Paul and Plato as the teachers of mankind. In other words, Mr. Looney actually worshipped Shakespeare, literally. So a secular scripture meets an allegorical reading to create an all-encompassing narrative. And the all-encompassing is important here. As the American thinker Richard Hofstadter recognized back in 1964 in an essay called The Paranoid Style in American Politics, written in the 1960s, it could have been written yesterday. It's so prescient. He says, the paranoid mentality is far more coherent than the real world, since it leaves no room for mistakes, failures, or ambiguities. Or as Michael Barkin has noted, for the conspiracy theorist, quote, nothing happens by accident. Conspiracies imply a world based on intentionality, from which accident and coincidence have been removed. Anything that happens occurs because it has been willed, end quote. So for the conspiracy theorist, there is no room for confusion or chaos, screw-ups, simple human indolence. The contingencies of everyday existence are not acknowledged. For some Shakespeare conspiracy theorists, this means drilling down to textual minutiae. Numerous theorists, beginning with Delia Bacon, have looked for anagrams and secret symbols and other coded messages in Shakespeare's text, circling letters, looking for variant spellings, counting. This way madness lies. And by the way, it entirely ignores the slapdash nature of early modern printing practices. To generate an allegorical reading of someone like Shakespeare, about whom so much has been written, conspiracy theorists have to generate an allegory that expands every time a new fact or reference is discovered. And so the alternate narrative that the allegorical reading generates becomes increasingly complex, convoluted, and granular. But no matter how complex and evolved they are, how extended these allegories, in their drive to solve everything, to sew it up neatly, put a bow on it, they are, I would argue, as literature, reductionist. Which brings me to the second point about conspiracy theories as a type of literature. If we are to think of conspiracy theories as literature, if we were to teach them in a course, they are, at best, genre fiction. And by genre, I mean those books and other narratives that follow a simple, well-established set of conventions, a formula. Think of mystery novels or romance novels or movies, action movies or rom-com movies. Think of the organization of a bookstore. There is a section called Fiction and Literature, where the serious stuff is, and then there are these other sections, mystery, romance, horror, fantasy. That's the genre fiction. And this is not, I'm not being snobbish about this. This is not necessarily a bad thing. Genre fiction can be incredibly entertaining. You should see some of the stuff I read on my days off. They're amongst the most popular narratives in the world. Who doesn't love a good mystery? But there's a reason they're not in the literature section. Here's a little story. Many years ago, I taught a first-year course, big class, 250 students, called The Blockbuster. We studied books that had sold over 40 million copies each. They included an Agatha Christie novel, Valley of the Dolls, Jonathan Livingston Seagull, and the Da Vinci Code. Now, each of those books is an interesting cultural artifact, telling us something about the moment in which they garnered their popularity. And that's how we studied them. The course was called Literature and Culture. Okay. We stretched our imaginations to understand the past appeal of these books. We weren't always successful. My students were baffled by Jonathan Livingston Seagull. They kept saying, what were they smoking in 1970?
At SFU, it was the same thing they're smoking now.
Yeah.
They seemed good at the time.
I guess. And now it's legal. So maybe we should go back. No. So these books are interesting as cultural artifacts, but I would argue that none of them are great literature. None of them reveals new layers of meaning on subsequent readings. How often do you want to read a mystery twice? None of them contain shades of ambiguity. These books are formulaic. They offer a simple theme, a simple storyline, and the good ones do it well. They're entertaining as narratives because they present and solve a mystery or they're salacious, but they aren't in the literature section. Now, the specific literary genre that conspiracy theories try to invoke is the thriller or the mystery. Those novels and movies in which a protagonist engages with a large, malevolent force that threatens his life, or the protagonist solves some mystery by examining obscure clues that everyone else has failed to recognize. And the rhetoric of Shakespeare conspiracy theorists, if you go to their websites, suggests that they do see themselves as Hercule Poirot's or Robert Langdon's, the protagonist of the Da Vinci Code. But here's the problem. In their interpretive zeal to impose the genre conventions of the mystery or thriller upon Shakespeare's writing itself, they reduce Shakespeare. They reduce his plays and poems to a mystery novel. They read Shakespeare's plays as the veiled autobiography of a dashing courtier negotiating the cutthroat politics of the Elizabethan court. As for the sonnets, well, you just have to read them backwards. All right? It's the autobiography of the Earl of Oxford. They reduce Shakespeare's writing to a puzzle. They solve it, turning it into an Agatha Christie novel, revealing the hidden clues and shouting, aha, got you. Let me give you a simple example. The Oxford enthusiasts have argued that Hamlet is a critique of the later Elizabethan court by an insider, the Earl of Oxford. Specifically, they say the character of Polonius, the old man who's the father of Ophelia, is supposed to be a parody of Queen Elizabeth's most important advisor, Sir William Cecil Lord Burleigh. In other words, the character and other parts of the play are read allegorically. The fact that supports this theory is that they say Cecil's nickname was Polus, and so everyone would have known Polonius was Wait a minute, let's just stop. Polus? What kind of a nickname is Polus? The Latin word for heaven. Queen Elizabeth I did give nicknames to her courtiers. She called Essex the Gypsy because of his dark complexion. She called William Cecil the Fox because he was smart. Polus? Where is this from? Well, the source is supposed to be 4 Latin tracts that were written by Gabriel Harvey in the 16th century, the third of which is addressed to Cecil. In it, Harvey is supposed to have called Cecil by his secret nickname, Polus. Now, my Latin is very bad. I had Latin in high school, but it has faded. But I got that tract out, and I read it in Latin, and I found something really interesting. The word Polus does not appear in it at all. Okay. But the conspiracy theorist persists. Hamlet is an allegorically. And so Hamlet, one of the richest and most resonant pieces of literature in the Western tradition, a work radical in its foregrounding of human consciousness, struggling to make sense of an endlessly complex world, is really an allegory, a critique of Queen Elizabeth's court that they have solved. Remember Mr. Trickia? There's only one way to read them, and the other ways are clearly wrong. Not only his works, but Shakespeare's life can be solved. Missing years, ambiguities about his family, writing, knowledge, we've got the answer. Just plug in this other person, rearrange a huge number of dates and references, and you've got a solution. Shakespeare's genius is not mysterious because he was well-educated and traveled nobleman, writing about his own life. Solved. Everything that distinguishes great literature, ambiguity, the ineffable, plurality, subtlety, is pushed aside. Everything that surprises us about the human condition can be explained by exposing the conspiracy. That's what I mean by reductionist. Compare this to how Shakespeare depicts conspiracies in his plays. In Henry V, just before King Henry is to launch his war on France, a conspiracy against him by 3 English noblemen is uncovered. Henry arrests them and confronts the traitors, and he is baffled by their treachery, especially that of his friend Lord Scrope. He says, "'Tis so strange that though the truth of it stands off as gross as black on white, my eye will scarcely see it." There is no explanation. Scrope had everything going for him. Show men dutiful, why so didst thou? Seem they grave and learned, why so didst thou? Come they of noble family, why so didst thou? Henry says to him, "I will weep for thee, for this revolt of thine methinks is like another fall of man." See, there's no easy answers. The conspiracy cannot easily be explained. At a certain level, it cannot be explained at all. Shakespeare refuses to reduce human beings to genre fiction cliches. In Julius Caesar, the conspiracy against Caesar ends up being directed by Caesar's friend, Brutus. Brutus kills Caesar based on a theoretical speculation. Caesar might want to become king. Now, Brutus knows it's only a speculation, yet he helps butcher the greatest man in Rome, his friend. But at the end of the play, Mark Antony stands over his dead body and calls Brutus the noblest Roman of them all. And we, watching the play, may agree with him, depending on the production, because it's not black and white. There are no easy answers in history, in life, or in literature. But there are in mystery novels. What is the attraction, the pleasure of these sort of narratives besides their simple answers? I think above all, they create a sense of community. Conspiracy theorists band together, most often on the internet nowadays, into communities of belief to congratulate themselves on their insider knowledge and to exchange clues. Unlike everyone else, they have seen through the cover story of the hidden reality. They're not one of the ignorant. Which brings us to the last ingredient that conspiracies in their genre fiction reduction of reality need, a bad guy. Because what's a mystery, what's a thriller without a bad guy? The conspiracies in Shakespeare and the conspiracies of his age were actually generated by people bent on attacking authority figures, someone above them. The senators of Rome conspired to kill Caesar. The British noblemen conspired to kill Henry V. Guy Fawkes was close to blowing up the royal family. Modern conspiracy theories, to a large extent, represent the opposite. It's the authority figures who are conspiring against the people. And as mentioned, the theories of Shakespeare appeared in the period when he was elevated to a sort of moral quasi-religious position. It was also the time when English literature was beginning to emerge as an actual field of academic study. This meant the emergence of a class of professional Shakespeare scholars that claimed some authority. In the mind of the conspiracy theorists, Shakespeareans, or as they call us, Stratfordians, came to be imagined as a monolithic block of conspirators intentionally misleading the public about the identity of the author of Shakespeare's work. Why would we do this? To accrue staggering power and untold riches. Richard Hofstadter has noticed that the imaginary mastermind behind most American conspiracies of the 20th century is a cartoonish figure that he describes as, quote, a perfect model of malice, a kind of amoral Superman, sinister, ubiquitous, powerful, cruel, sensual, luxury-loving. I think we know who that sounds like. And hence Mr. Tricka's email to me. I'm the bad guy. So the conspiracy theories as a literary genre substitute out the pleasures of narrative richness for something else, a sort of theology, a belief system that reveals the truth behind events describing a narrative that fits neatly in the genre section of the bookstore. And the engagement with this narrative not only grants a sense of community, of being part of an elect few, it gives its proponents an enemy, someone to hate. Now, why is this important? So what if conspiracy theorists read Shakespeare allegorically or try to reduce his works to mystery novels? Well, this brings us back to the failure of imagination that I see as crucial to so many conspiracy theories. As I mentioned, the failure that generated Shakespeare conspiracies was an historical one, an inability of the 19th century theorists to understand the fundamentally different conditions of the early modern period, the Renaissance. They assumed a trans-historical essentialism, which was in part tied to their perception of Shakespeare as a speaker of universal truths, truths that were supposed to transcend time. The conspiracy theorists looked and continue to look at events historically, but they import contemporary assumptions and cultural values into the past so they can pass judgment. It's a sort of corrective hindsight. And sometimes this has to do with specific practices or events that are read through a contemporary lens. I'll give you some examples. Conspiracy theorists love to point out that Shakespeare spelled his name different ways when he wrote his signature. Well, that does sound suspicious, except it was entirely commonplace. Sir Walter Raleigh spelled his own name 4 different ways. Philip Henslowe, who was played by Geoffrey Rush in the movie Shakespeare in Love, spelt his own name dozens of ways in his own diary. Or this, Shakespeare's name did not appear on the first printed editions of his plays. Uh-oh, the true author must have wanted to remain anonymous. But this is true of virtually all the early published plays. No one cared about the authors in the early days of professional theater, any more than you care who wrote the screenplay for your favorite episode of The Big Bang Theory. Shakespeare would go on to become one of the first authors whose name was regularly printed on published plays. But more often, and much more importantly, this failure of historical imagination is applied to beliefs and values of the past. And this is, I think, the important thing. And this is tricky because we often fail to recognize the cultural forces that have shaped our own belief systems. And so we read them unthinkingly into the past or into other people. I warn my students about this tendency all the time. When I explain some strange and sometimes repugnant belief of the past to my students, a few of them inevitably will say, well, I wouldn't have believed that. That's stupid. And I always explain to them that by saying that, they are signaling that they are just the sort of person who would have believed. Because if they are incapable of imagining anything other than what they believe in this historical moment, in this culture, they would have not been able to imagine themselves out of the culture of the past had they been born there. Because conspiracy theorists seem incapable of accepting that the past is a foreign country, this misalignment of values between our time and the past is thought to demonstrate subterfuge. So, for example, conspiracy theorists jump on the fact that Shakespeare's wife and daughters were never taught to read. How could that be? The greatest writer in history didn't teach his children to read. The man who gave us Rosalind and Viola and Beatrice did not empower the women in his life? No. No, he didn't. It would have been very odd if he had. Very, very few women were taught to read and write in Shakespeare's time, especially in the countryside. They didn't have the time. Or the idea that Shakespeare's descendants, some 30 or 40 years after his death, during the interregnum, that is the English Civil War when there was no king, in which no plays were staged, there were no plays staged between 1642 and 1660, that somewhere in that period, some grandchild or daughter may have just thrown out Shakespeare's old papers. He's been dead for 40 years. No plays have been put on for 15 years. Throw them out. Impossible, say the conspiracy theorists. Someone must have known at the time of their significance and preserved them for future generation. Where are those precious handwritten manuscripts? Where are his letters? Almost no theatrical manuscripts exist from this period. You know what else we don't have the manuscript that makes me really suspicious? The King James Bible. Who really wrote it, people? Now, the Shakespeare conspiracy theorist's failure of imagination is along historical lines. But there are many other conspiracy theories generated by other failures of imagination. The failure to imagine another culture. The failure to imagine someone else's values or material conditions. The failure to imagine a world in which coincidence and happenstance and chaos does occur. And this is increasingly a problem. In the United States, violence has been narrowly avoided because proponents of various conspiracy theories have attempted or promised to act on their beliefs. In comparison, the conspiracy theories around Shakespeare seem quaint. In the grand scheme of things, do we really care who wrote Shakespeare's plays? Maybe not. One of the things that recent scholarship has proven is how much of Shakespeare's works were written in collaboration with other authors, including Christopher Marlowe. Some of the beloved passages that you know from Shakespeare may not have been written by him. But it is important if you value literature, if you value history, if you care about the complexities and contingencies that nuance the human experience. For conspiracy theories, even ones as ultimately insignificant as the Shakespeare authorship one, flatten out reality and impose upon it a simplistic moral rhetoric, the moral rhetoric of genre fiction, reducing reality to good guys versus bad guys, us versus them, imposing a banal, all-encompassing narrative on the messiness of lived reality and telling people to pick a side. It's not surprising that conspiracy theories are flourishing in the United States right now. That country is profoundly divided along ideological lines. It's simply easier to explain away the intentions of people on the other side of that divide through a conspiracy theory than it is to engage with their reality, to accept the play of ideas, to look for compromise. It's easier to buy into a demonizing narrative about the other person's intention than it is to imagine being them, in part because imagining the other can lead to empathy. In just over a month, I will be going to Denver, Colorado, to attend the annual meeting of the Shakespeare Association of America, the largest annual gathering of Shakespeare scholars in the world. Picture, if you can, 1,400 Shakespeare scholars in one hotel. And let me tell you, that's a good-looking bunch of people. This year, as in the past, I will sit across the table from other scholars and we will disagree, sometimes profoundly, over the meaning of Shakespeare's works. The only constant from year to year is that in all those discussions, I'm right and the other person's wrong. What happens at those conferences is that we argue. We do not agree, because we are not committed to creating an orthodoxy, a master narrative, an allegorical reading that solves everything, because we're not engaged with a mystery novel, something that clicks shut on the last page. Instead, we are engaged with the inexhaustible play of meaning that great art inspires. In this case, the creation of Shakespeare's genius, but also the talent of his collaborators, the constraints of his theatrical conditions and the contingencies of historical transmission. And perhaps this is why great literature, great art, like Shakespeare, is important, because it continually makes us imagine. Imagine another time. Imagine another culture. Imagine understanding reality in a different way. It tricks us into imagining what it must be like to be the other. And that's our Shakespeare conspiracy. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Paul, for an insightful, humorous, and provoking talk. I think we know now why Paul has won teaching awards. And there is an opportunity. We have a couple of people, Magda and Ryan, with microphones who are going to come around if you have any questions. I have one myself, which I will throw in if time allows. But does anyone have any questions or comments they'd like to put to Paul?
So I tend to adopt the perspective that I love Shakespeare, whoever it was that wrote those plays. And you acknowledge the historical reality of other authorship as part of the contribution to the plays. So is it not reasonable to adopt the view that there are perhaps multiple authors contributing to the works? Can you adopt that point of view without being part of the crazy community?
Absolutely. We have to remember that theater in the Elizabethan period, the Jacobean period, was slapdash. They had to churn these plays out. And we know from reading documents like Philip Henslow's diary that very often he would get together 3 or 4 playwrights, right? And they said, well, here's a story. Okay, you write the funny bit, you write the serious bit, you write the old guy speech. And they would churn these things out, right? And we know that Shakespeare, like his last play, Henry VIII, written largely with Fletcher. Henry VI, Part 1, probably written with Christopher Marlowe. We know a bunch of this stuff, but for centuries, in the Victorian period, they wanted to deny that. They just said, no, it's just Shakespeare, the god. But absolutely, it's probably more common than we even know, the collaborative effort of playwrights in this period. Some of them, that's all they did was collaborate, like constantly, never wrote plays by themselves. So yes, it's not that's perfectly sensible, and it reflects the theatrical reality of the time. Yeah.
Other comments or questions? Right back here.
Well, that wonderful production at
Thank you.
the Bard of Shakespeare in Love.
Yes.
Isn't it great to see Marlowe sitting there and
Yes.
saying, we got to get another play out, man?
Yeah,
He goes,
I love that.
How about this? And he's like,
Yeah.
oh, how about that?
Yeah.
So isn't that exactly what,
Yeah.
a good representation?
Yeah, I think it is, and that's why I love that movie when it came out, because yeah, obviously these playwrights got together and they collaborated and they talked about things, and someone said, Will, you're crazy, don't do that, try this. And they swapped ideas, and they handed around books and said, look at page 6, there's a great story you can steal, right? So yes, there was lots of that in the period. It wasn't the model of the romantic author in his garret turning out something perfect and then presenting it to the world as this object, aesthetic object that mustn't be done. Theater is messy. Theater is sloppy, right? If you've ever been involved in theater, you know how things change and evolve. And that's what it was like. So yes, I love that in Shakespearean Love.
A question up here or a comment up here?
Thank you for your presentation. I was especially interested in your matter-of-fact description of Shakespeare and his life. And it occurred to me that it's just astonishing to think that he may have had no idea that he was the greatest playwright in history and not necessarily cared either. And that may have contributed to what you said, his documents being tossed because who needs granddad's old documents? Do you think that's true? Do you think he had any idea of it?
Yes, absolutely. And we have to also remember that plays themselves were not considered serious literature. Shakespeare clearly did not spend any real time worrying about how his plays were printed. Plays, by the way, didn't belong to the authors. They were sold to the theatrical company. They were the property of the company, so the company got them printed. He did care about the printing of his poetry. So that's different because poetry is serious stuff. To give you an example of this, in the early 17th century, Sir Thomas Bodleian opened the Bodleian Library at Oxford University. And his idea was everything that's printed in England, we're going to get a copy of and put in this library. But, he said, don't bother with plays, because they weren't considered serious. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to throw in my question. Paul, your talk is all about conspiracy theories about Shakespeare, but I'm wondering what you'd say about Shakespeare as a conspiracy theorist. One of my favorite books, I'm sure you're aware of it, Daughter of Time, is a mystery novel, but not really a novel that arguably has a conspiracy theory, but it essentially alleges that Shakespeare himself was implicated in a conspiracy theory to try to stick Richard III, Richard Plantagenet, with a murder that was more likely committed by Henry Tudor. And I think there's a pretty strong historical basis for that argument, and that Shakespeare played a role in trying to perpetuate that conspiracy theory. So was Shakespeare himself a conspiracy theorist?
I don't think Shakespeare would have thought of it that way. I think Shakespeare, who's one of the few playwrights of this period who didn't get arrested, and whose company eventually became the King's Men in 1603, so they had the royal approval. He was very careful. He knew which side of the bread to butter. And so when you get a Scottish king who wrote a book about witchcraft, we're writing Macbeth, right? And we're going to change the history a bit so his descendants look better. Now, is that a conspiracy or is that just smart? Right? And I say the same thing with the Daughter of Time. Yeah.
Other comments or questions? Yeah, there's one back here.
Yep.
Very entertaining and thought-provoking.
Thank you.
One question I had, when Shakespearean scholars get together, as you will in Denver, what's the flashpoint? Like, what's the most contentious issue that you have disagreements with your fellow scholars?
It depends. It changes. But it's interesting, this idea that Shakespeare's plays he could not have revised them. They must have been perfect. Or that, for example, there are two versions of King Lear. One is called The Tragedy of King Lear, one is called The History of King Lear. They're different by almost 400 lines. For centuries, critics said, well, that's impossible. Obviously, the printer screwed up. So they took the two King Lears and mushed them together to create the one that you probably read as a young person, a conflated edition. It's only in the 1980s that editors started saying, wait a minute, why couldn't he have revised the play? And I remember shouting matches at a Shakespeare conference in the 1980s about that subject, because obviously if you'd written a whole book, say, on King Lear based on this conflated edition of King Lear, you didn't want to hear that, no, he didn't write that. He wrote this version and that version, right? Those lines you like, they're not in there. So that's one of the biggest ones I remember, the only time I remember people shouting at each other. But it varies. Think of a topic. Right now, eco-criticism is very big. So looking at Shakespeare's work for environmental and ecological themes. So that can get people head up, too. Yeah.
Did Shakespeare recycle? That's the one. Any other questions? Yes.
This business of committees writing plays, that goes on and it's very important today.
Yeah.
You mentioned the Big Bang Theory. That's actually written by writers who write jokes. It's even written by physicists who are responsible for all the blackboards.
Yes.
Spoken as a true physicist, I might add.
And go to the movies and notice how often there's like three screenwriters attached to a film. Sometimes you think, really? It took 3 people to write this? But yeah, most TV shows, et cetera, have a writer's room. It's a bunch of people sitting around a table pitching ideas and saying, oh, he's good at that, you write this scene. And that's obviously how it was back in this period, because they were churning out the plays.
We'll take one or possibly two more questions. One here and then one up here, and then we'll call it quits for the questions. Yeah, over here.
Thank you so much for your presentation.
Welcome.
I'm just curious. You are a scholar in Shakespeare, of course, and I was wondering if you can tell us what led you to
Shakespeare?
that particular interest in Shakespeare. What called your attention to that subject?
When I was in graduate school, I had to choose what I was going to write my PhD on. And I was interested in historical literature because I wanted to escape our reality. And I was also interested in theater. And when you write a PhD thesis, it sometimes ends up defining your academic career, right? Because they're going to hire you to teach that subject. So I sort of consciously decided, well, if this is going to define my life, I don't want to get bored. So I'm going to take the biggest, hardest, greatest writer, Shakespeare, all right? And I'll never get bored with him. And there's always universities hiring Shakespeare professors. And I was right on both counts.
And Seth has the microphone over here for the last question.
Yes, yes, sir.
Is there a great deal of potential or work being done in the understanding the difference between quality writing in the plays versus the poetry? And what else has come of that in terms of the conclusions?
Well, that's a big question. If you can hear it, the quality of the poetry in the plays and the poems. That's a hard one to answer. Very often, the people who study the plays and the people who study the poems are sort of different camps. And it's clear that Shakespeare thought of them as very different styles of writing. Like I say, he was concerned about the publication of the sonnets, but less so about the plays. And in the plays, because they were written over a course of almost 20 years, I mean, basically, if you parse it out, he's writing approximately 2 plays a year for 20 years. You can see in the poetry of the drama a huge evolution from the early plays to the late plays. It becomes much more terse, compact, and he starts using more prose. Whereas the poetry, well, first of all, he's using a very restricted form, the sonnets, or in his longer poems, certain stanza forms. And that enforces a certain style, plus it's not going to be performed publicly, it's going to be read, so I think he spent a lot more time laboring over that and the poetic verse. Also, I don't want to get too technical, but the purpose of poetry in drama is different from the purpose of poetry in verse. In drama, iambic pentameter, that ba-bump, 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 is designed to lead the actors to emphasize certain words and reveal the psychology of the characters, right? Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 2. Hamlet wants to go back to university. His hated stepfather, Claudius, says, no, don't go. And then his mother says, please don't go. And Hamlet says, I shall in all my best obey you, madam. The you breaks the rhythm, right? So this is the hint to the actor that you have to read it this way. I shall in all of my best obey you, madam, not him. So the psychology of the character is in the meter. And that's not what happens in the lyric verse. You're trying for something much more lyrical and flowing.
Well, the sign of a great playwright is that his plays are still read and debated and performed centuries after his death. The sign of a great teacher is that he can, centuries after that playwright, shine light that is contemporary, illuminating, humorous, and fascinating, and bring out an audience like this tonight. So on all of our behalf, I want to ask you to join with me in thanking Paul Budra for just a fascinating lecture.
Thank you.
I assume, Paul, that you were the only author of that lecture. So I'm so grateful for people coming out tonight. SFU Public Square, as I say, is very committed to be Canada's engaged university, but it has to be two-way. We can't engage with you if you don't engage with us as you have tonight. SFU Public Square does a whole set of different kinds of public events throughout the year. I encourage you to check out their website and to see what's happening. And of course, there's all sorts of other events that SFU is involved with. I mentioned the Burnaby Festival of Learning, which will be coming up. There are many other things as well. I also want to do a real shout out to the people and volunteers who work with SFU Public Square who've helped us mount this tonight. Maybe you could help me thank them, Seth and the crew here.